Okay, so welcome back. Here are the two queries that I mentioned in the last video. These queries are inserting the items that are found into our users materials table. I've changed a couple of the things within our table, a couple of the fields. I've changed the user ID to the character ID, and I've also placed a default of 1 onto our material quantity. So if we have a look at this query, what we're saying is we want to insert into the user materials table, and then we're setting 3 of the fields. We're setting the character ID, the material ID, and the material type. The material type is a static input or a static value, depending on what type of item we actually find. The material ID is the ID of the row that we've already queried, and our character ID is the session CID. Now, if you remember, when we created this table, we actually created 3 indexes, and this is now going to come into play. If the character ID, material ID, and material type all equal the same as as values currently within the database or within the table, then this little line runs, and it's saying on duplicate key, then we want to update the material quantity, and we're making that equal the current material quantity plus 1. So in fact, we are actually, instead of inserting a new row into the table, we are increasing the quantity of that specific item that our character currently has. So once we've set this query, we're executing it, and this adds the item into the database. Okay, so now we are successfully adding items into a user materials list. What we need to do is we now need to list these items out in a player's inventory. I've moved the buttons up here, so we've got our map, we've got the search area, and I've added an items button as well. So we now need to make a new plugin, which will be the items lists. So we're going to start off the plugin like usual, including all the files we need to include. Then we're going to save it into our plugin folder, and we're going to call this item list, not forgetting to in fact add a folder with the same name, and to also add class in there. Okay, so here's our new plugin. Sorry, I don't know why I put class, that needs to be plugin. Plugin. Right. So now we need to gather up a list of all the items that are currently in our database. Okay, so here are the queries we want to run. Our first one, we're selecting the material ID and the material quantity from the user materials, where our character ID equals CID and material type equals compound. We're executing the query, and then we're running a while loop on these objects, and we're storing them in an array called compounds. We're then doing the same thing, but this time for stabilizers. Now we've got these arrays set up. What we need to do is we now need to create a couple of divs so we can list each of the materials and their quantities. So we create a div, and we just give it some inline styling for a moment. Going to make the width 200 pixels. We'll make it 250 pixels, and we're going to float them to the left. We'll just give it a H3 heading here, and just call this compounds. Now inside of this div we want to open and close our PHP tags and do a for each loop inside of here. The first one is obviously going to be the compounds array as v, open and close braces, and then we want to echo out in paragraph tags. We're going to have v, now we want the ID of the item, followed by the quantity, or a label for the quantity, then the array element of quantity, followed by a closing paragraph tag. We'll copy this and paste it and change this compound to stabilizers. Save that. Now on my list of buttons here, on the items button I've added an on click of load plugin, and we're loading the plugin item list. So now if we come and refresh this and we click items, what you can see here is we've got a list of all of the compounds that we've collected and the quantity that we've managed to collect. And here we've got the list of the compound. Oh, sorry, that's meant to be stabilizers. Just go back and change that. Save that and just click items again, and that'll refresh this plugin. But the item IDs are of no use to us, or of no use to the player, because they don't know what IDs relate to what items. So we need to change up our query a bit. So I'll do this and then I'll come back and explain it. Okay, so this is the new query that we're running. We're selecting from the user materials table. We're taking the material ID and giving it an alias of material ID. We're doing the same with the material quantity, and then we're selecting from the compound table the name, and we're giving it an alias of material name. Selecting all this from the user materials table, we're then performing an inner join using the compound table on, or where the user materials material ID equals the compound ID, where our character ID and material type equal the same thing. we've got the same thing going on here for the stabilizer. We're selecting from the stabilizer table instead of the compound table. So now what we need to do on this array, we need to add another element, which is the name, and we setting this to equal row material name, and we'll just take this and add it in there as well. So in our div here we can change the ID to name, and I'll just put a little dash in there, and the same thing on the stabilizers. When we save that and come back over to our list, when we refresh the list, you can see instead of the IDs being there, we're actually having the names of the items presented to us. So now we've listed all of the items, what we can do is we can then add actions to these, so we can throw away some of these materials that we don't want. We won't do that one next, but what we are going to work on next is refining these items into raw materials. So I'm not going to start that in this video because it's late and I need to do some prep work before we move on. So I'm going to end this video here, and I'm just going to finish by saying that you can still head over to the forum and you can go to the Project Station Invasion talk section of the forum, which no one has done yet, so feel free to be the first, and you can ask any questions or post any suggestions for this game. So I'm going to leave it here, and I'll speak to you in the next video.